Ryan Lizza é correspondente em Washington da revista The New Yorker e já escreve sobre política norte-americana desde o final dos anos 1990. Ele também é colaborador da CNN e já escreveu os perfis de políticos importantes nos Estados Unidos, como Barack Obama, John McCain e também Hillary Clinton. Ele esteve na PUC-Rio para discutir o futuro da imprensa no festival Piauí Globonews de jornalismo. So, good evening, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks for
And first of all, what is the importance of discussing the subject of journalism in universities and colleges?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, you know, I think that now more than ever, it's very important for people in college and who are coming out of school to understand some of the challenges in journalism. In the United States, when people would ask me, should I go to journalism school? Should I study journalism? Years ago, like 20 years ago, I used to tell people, no. You don't need to go to journalism school. Just go work at a newspaper or a magazine or a network, and you'll learn everything you need to learn. Now, 20 years later, when people ask me that question, I say, you know what? Journalism school is a really good idea. And the reason for the change is that there are a lot of, there aren't as many places, or let me put it this way, there are a lot of places where you can become a young journalist and not learn the best practices of journalism. And journalism schools are some of the places that are carrying that wisdom forward that only the best journalistic institutions practice. So that's one reason. The other reason is that we're living, in the United States anyway, we're living in a very kind of tumultuous time for journalists. We have a president who likes to verbally attack journalists all the time and likes to do as much as he can to discredit factual news reporting about him and his administration. And that's led to, increased distrust in the news media in the United States. And so at least in the United States, it's really important to point that out and to explain to people what's true and what's not. So here in Brazil, I'm not an expert on Brazilian politics or what's going on in your own country, but it's always important to come and talk to students about what journalism is and why it's important.
And looking at the constant digital revolution, and as you work on newspaper, what do you think which is the future of the press, of the newspapers and magazines? And do you think they will become extinct, or they can manage to renew themselves in order to manage and get other ways to get the public?
Yeah. Well, so in my own career, I've always worked at magazines, and so I graduated from college in 1997. And so when I started college I started in 1993. When I started college, the internet was not a well-known mass phenomenon, right? Most people in America or most places in the world could not have told you what the internet is. They could not have told you what the World Wide Web is. They could not have told you what a URL is or a browser. That's when I started college. By the time I graduated college, just about everybody in America knew what the internet was. And so my whole college career sort of straddled the pre and post-internet world. And so my entire journalism career has coincided with the really dramatic technological changes that have changed everything in the journalism business. So I've been at magazines that have struggled with this question. One magazine in the United States called The New Republic. I was at a monthly magazine called GQ. You have a version here in Brazil. and now I've written for other American magazines like the Atlantic and New York, and now I'm at the New Yorker. Every one of those magazines I've worked at still exists and still publishes a physical copy. 2 of them went from weeklies to bi-weeklies. I think for the best magazines and the best newspapers in the United States and elsewhere, the print product will survive for quite a long time. You know, people who subscribe to the New Yorker still like to get a physical copy of it. But the phrase a lot of people use in the business, on the business side of things, is that we are platform agnostic. In other words, it doesn't matter to us how you read our content. If you like to get it every week in a physical magazine, fine, you can subscribe to that. If you like to read it on your if you like to read it on your phone, fine, do that. iPad, laptop, whatever it is. We don't really care about the platform. It's the content that matters, right? And so I think most publications will adopt that view. And if it makes economic sense, sure, they will keep printing a physical copy. But it's not, you don't need to be wedded to a physical copy. You can read it on whatever you want. And in 10 years, 20 years, there'll probably be some way to read things that we haven't even thought of yet.
So, and politics are an area in which fake news spread very quickly. And you said that on your first answer. So, which role did fake news played in last American election?
It's a really important question, and there are a number of ways it played a role. It played a role in some ways. It played a role in reinforcing the pre-existing political beliefs of partisans. In other words, if you're on Facebook and all of your friends love Donald Trump and hate Hillary Clinton, you're probably very likely to encounter one of the fake news stories that was generated by various entities that said lots of terrible things about Hillary Clinton and lots of great things about Donald Trump. And maybe you shared that with all of your friends and it circulated among that group. That's very common. There's been a version of that in American politics for as long as the country. So that's one way in which it spread. There was a slightly more sinister way that it was used, and that the one that is more concerning in American politics is that a foreign power that has an adversarial relationship with the United States, Russia, helped generate and spread fake articles that were manufactured, both to sow chaos and confusion and divide different groups, but also it seems towards the end of the election to benefit Donald Trump and damage Hillary Clinton. And right now there's a lot of investigating going on to sort of figure out how much of this fake news was generated and promoted by a foreign power and how much was just partisans in America making shit up and circulating it on their own. But it's a very, very important question because it goes to the core of our democracy, and we need to know how much influence, how much money was spent by non-Americans to try and sow confusion and chaos in our election. But the reason it was allowed to be spread by either just partisans who hated one of the candidates and wanted to do this, or by foreign power, partly was because of the enormous power of social media that exists now in all of our societies, and the unwillingness of companies like Facebook and to a lesser extent Google, because it's not as important, but mostly Facebook. they're the 800-pound gorilla. They're the biggest source of information and news for so many people. But their unwillingness to understand and accept the fact that they are media companies, right? And that they have some responsibility to, I don't really want to use the word police, but some responsibility to combat this phenomenon. And they've been very, very slow to act.
And what a journalist must do in order not to get caught by this trap, by fake news.
You have to be very careful because all of us, usually what happens is you get burned once. You're on Twitter and you retweet or you circulate some picture or article that's not true, and then you never make that mistake again because you remember the first lesson of journalism, first rule of journalism, to always verify something before you circulate it. And retweeting is circulating something. And so the first thing is understanding as a journalist that your use of social media should be no different than your publishing of something in a newspaper or magazine. When you circulate, when you share, you've got to use all of the standards that you would use if you were writing something on your own website or in your own magazine. So you have to check. And then a lot of news organizations, a lot of the big mainstream news organizations now have fake news and fact-checking as a beat. So they have reporters dedicated to exposing hoaxes, to fact-checking things, to showing and explaining what's real and what's not. And there are websites that have existed that have been doing this for years. A very famous one is Snopes.com, but some other big ones in the United States like factcheck.org. So there are a lot of journalistic resources by mainstream news organizations going into debunking fake news. But the organizations that have to get involved in this are the ones that help circulate it, and that's Facebook and Twitter. And they need to do something to, when they spot something that is not true, to flag it in some way. And they're not doing a good job. After this horrible shooting in Las Vegas recently, on Facebook, stories that were completely wrong and manufactured and fake shot up to the trend and were trending for hours and hours after they had been debunked. So responsibility starts with consumers of news. They can't be so stupid as to just believe everything they see. You have to be a smart consumer. Then there's a lot of responsibility in the mainstream journalistic organizations, which need to spend additional resources fact-checking these fake articles. And then the social media companies that distribute them need to admit that they have an important role to play.
And is there any difference in covering Obama's and Trump's government, how it is to do it?
Obama's government was more organized and more disciplined, and because of that they could be very frustrating to cover because they exercised a certain amount of control over the flow of information that they wanted to go to the press and to the public. And so in some ways it was more difficult. The Trump administration is not organized. It's deeply dysfunctional, and it has many rival factions in the White House and elsewhere. And as a consequence, it's sometimes easier to get information from sources in the Trump administration than it was under Obama. It's a very, the more chaotic an institution, the more sources of information there are. That's often the case. So that's one difference. The other difference is, there's just the obvious differences between Trump and Obama. I can't think of two people who are more dissimilar. And so that's one thing. The other thing is just in the United States, any journalist who's my age, I'm 43, we don't have any experience covering someone like Trump. We've never had a candidate like Donald Trump in modern American history. So we sometimes look at like Italy and Berlusconi, maybe a little bit Russia and Putin, Erdogan in Turkey. Trump's been compared to lots and lots of different styles of leadership around the world. Populists, people who are either strong men or autocrats or have those tendencies. We've never had a president like that. And so the challenge in covering him is to recognize the norms that he's violating, and recognize the things that he's doing that are not normal in American politics. And we talk a lot about don't normalize some of the things that he's doing, and that's a challenge as a journalist, is to educate the public about when he's violating norms, when lack of disclosure or transparency is not the way it was with previous presidents, or when he says or does something that breaks with tradition. So it's a lot of that. It's a lot of like the basics of is this president so outside of the normal boundaries of American politics that it, not to be too dramatic, but that it threatens American democracy. There were elements of this with Nixon and Watergate. There were, frankly, elements of this with George W. Bush and some of his national security policies after 9/11. But we've never had someone who is so on the surface about not respecting the First Amendment, the freedom of the press, not respecting who admires people like Putin and who openly admires dictators, So it's a journalist. It was a big challenge when he became president, because he's so outside the traditional boundaries, and you don't want to be so alarmist that everything he does is, compare him to some dictator. But he does he is open about admiring some really ugly world leaders who don't respect democracy. And so I think there is a heightened sense among journalists that what they're doing is more important than anyone else they've ever covered.
So thank you, Ryan.
Thank
you.